to Spoiler Peace Theater, the podcast that doesn't give a shit about spoilers. We just want to talk about the movies. My name is Evan Crean. I am co-chair of the Boston Online Film Critics Association, co-author of your 80s movie guide to better living. I'm co-host of the It's the Pictures podcast, and my pronouns are he, him.
And my name is Megan Kearns. My pronouns are she, her. I write film reviews for Edge Media Network. I'm a co-host of the Slashers podcast, a member of the Boston Online Film Critics Association, and a member of Gallica, the Society of LGBTQ Entertainment Critics.
Yeah, you are.
I am.
Unfortunately, our co-host Dave is not here this week. He's a little bit under the weather, but we're sending him our well wishes, and yeah, we're carrying on in his stead.
We are, but it's sad. We miss you, Dave.
We have two movies we're going to talk about this week. Before we get to those, we'll just mention that over on our Patreon this week, we're talking about the winner of our Women-Directed Films poll. We got a chance this week, to talk about the 2011 film, Lynn Ramsey's 2011 film, We Need to Talk About Kevin. And boy, did we have some stuff to talk about, including Kevin.
Yes, lots to talk about.
Yeah. We go deep on that movie, and we had a really great conversation, I think.
Me
Although,
too.
interested to hear what Dave thinks of it when he has a chance to see it. And yeah, well, so let's get to this week's movies. So we're going to be talking about the documentary Ennio, about Ennio Morricone. And we are talking about Femme, which is a thriller that played at the Boston Underground Film Festival. And I believe it was the opening night film. Is that right?
The opening night film was immaculate.
Ah, okay. So I was wrong. But
that's okay. But it did play there.
Yes. So, and we're looking forward to talking about that as well. And Megan went to Boston Underground Film Festival and is planning on sharing more thoughts on the movies that played there at a later date. But let's start with this documentary, Ennio, which is it's IMDb says it's written and directed by Giuseppe Tornatore. That's an awesome name. And yeah, it's about the legendary film composer Ennio Morricone. And it looks like it's got a bunch of talking heads, famous people, other composers, directors. What'd you think, Megan?
Yeah, it also has Ennio Morricone himself talking throughout all of it, which is really cool. And yeah, I do wish Dave was here because one, I just wish he was here, but especially for a music documentary, because I am not a musical scholar. I'm not a musician the way Dave is. And I'm not the most knowledgeable about music. I will say it is probably one of my weaker spots. So it's a very straightforward documentary. There are a lot of talking heads. But it's also a very dense documentary in a way because Ennio Morricone has such a robust career and had such a vivid life. But it gets kind of into the weeds in a sense of, I'm sure not, if you're familiar with music, it's probably very, I don't want to say rudimentary, but probably very obvious. But for someone like me who is not into music composition, not into music theory, hearing him, it was fascinating hearing him talk about his inspirations and talk about his career path as a musician and then as a composer. But like, he gets very specific about certain melodies or certain tempos or certain notes or tonal qualities, and it just is really interesting, even if I didn't always know precisely what he was saying. And not that it's not, by no means is a convoluted or anything like that. It's just, it's not my wheelhouse. But it was really interesting listening to him talk about his work. It was interesting to hear other people talk about him too, although I found that less interesting. I liked it more when the documentary focused on Morricone himself. And it like sometimes a documentary, so it's a 2.5 hour documentary. It's very long.
It's dense.
Yeah, it is. It is. And sometimes it's very repetitive. So he would say something about himself, about something about his life, and then a talking head would say it too and like essentially repeat it. And I'm like, that's an interesting editing choice. Like, why would you leave that in there if somebody is saying something and it's not even like later in the film, like they really want to hammer home this point or remind you,
Mhm.
it's happening right after. And I'm like, that's kind of odd. So it did feel a bit repetitive. But having said that, I think especially about 30 minutes into the documentary, once he starts talking about film, that's when I found it really fascinating. But before that, he talks about how he wanted to be a doctor as a child, which I found so fascinating because I feel like a lot of times you hear these stories or you see in movies, people are like, I wanted to be an artist, but my parents wanted me to be a doctor or a
Right.
lawyer. No, his father was like, no, you're not going to be a doctor. You're going to study music and you're going to learn the trumpet like me. And so, and
He
he's
was
just,
rebelling against his artist
I
parents.
know. And he's like, yeah, so that's what happened. He's like, there was no other choice. My father made me play the trumpet. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, it just was so interesting. I found that fascinating. It talked about how he studied music and he loved Stravinsky and how he was really inspired by Stravinsky. And then it gets into how he started using like unconventional objects
Mm.
alongside compositions, like when he was doing composing, which is really unique and interesting. Like he would just use like kind of like random household objects or like cans or things like that to coincide with like singing or other musical instruments. And yeah, and then it gets into his film scoring, of course, and of course it gets into the Sergio Leone films that he did. And it was
Mhm.
interesting because Leone was an old classmate of his and they reconnected like when they were adults, and one of them was like, wait, did you go to such and such school? And the other one was like, yeah, I did. And so it's like weird that like they became like colleagues and friends, but they also knew
Mhm.
each other from school. So I thought that was kind of interesting. um, I also thought it was fascinating. He talks about how he wasn't happy with the score for Fistful of Dollars, but and I thought that was interesting because it's such an iconic score. But then he said he
Yeah.
really enjoyed the score for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Like for each of the films, he kind of changed it a bit, and then he finally got to a score that he really like enjoyed. And he talked about that like infamous kind of like that like kind of
Yeah.
whistle, that like wailing whistle, and how that was the coyote. And I'm like that was interesting. Like hearing about
That
that,
sounds interesting. I love
yeah,
that film, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and the score is just
score is incredible.
chef's kiss.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really interesting, like hearing people like Bruce Springsteen as a talking head talking about how when he saw that in the theaters, that like was a game changer for him. And he said, like, that I think he was the one who said, the only time I've ever raced out after seeing a movie that I had to go and buy the score. And I
Mhm.
was like, and so throughout the whole documentary, people are talking, composers, musicians, directors, they're talking about how phenomenal he is and what an artist and how unconventional and what a visionary, which is great. But it's also kind of it's so intriguing because Morricone is talking about how he felt not, I don't want to say ostracized because I don't know, he didn't use that word, but it seemed because he was unconventional, a lot of times he wasn't accepted into
Mm.
traditional composer circles, which is really interesting. Like at one point in the film, um someone said that there was one composer who worked with him who was his peer who likened film scoring to prostitution. Like it was just
Oh,
something like it was icky.
wow.
You didn't do it. You looked down on it. And so it wasn't like all composers had that view, but this particular composer who was kind of a mentor to him and worked with him did. And I was like, "Ooh, that's so interesting that this keeps coming up, that he's like, on one hand, people are saying he's such a visionary genius, and then on the other, people are kind of like dismissing or diminishing his work because it's for film." And I just found that so fascinating. But yeah, it was great listening to him talk about why he chose certain sounds or his process, and describing the sounds and what they sounded like and what he was inspired by. He talked about how he really enjoyed scoring Cinema Paradiso. And that was like nice. It was nice to see him so joyful talking about that, because he doesn't always have joy, or wasn't always palpable when he's talking about films. But then my favorite one of his scores, I was very excited to hear about The Untouchables, because I love that
Ooh, love that
ridiculous score.
movie.
I know. I love that movie. I love that score. It's kind of ridiculous. I love it. But he talked about the staircase scene, which is my favorite scene from that film.
Iconic.
Iconic, so tense. But he said that he starts off with a waltz, and he did that because it allowed him to change the tension of the scene. And I thought that was such, there was such like foresight and such thought that he put into that. And that was the thing, he always put so much thought into his composing. Like there were certain emotions he wanted to elicit, there were certain vibes he wanted people, a certain aesthetic he wanted people to have in conjunction with watching the film. And I just think that's really intriguing. The film also shows his honorary Oscar win and how he finally got, kind of awarded by the film community at the Academy Awards. And then, of course, Quentin Tarantino wanted him to do the score for The Hateful Eight, and how Morricone said that he wrote a quote, true symphony for that, and how it was probably, other talking heads were talking about how when Tarantino wanted Morricone to score that film, because Tarantino, of course, had used Morricone's existing work in like Kill Bill and in Death Proof. He probably had an idea of what Morricone was going to do, and this was very different. Like, this was not, the typical score that he would do. And Morricone said that he wanted to push himself. He wanted to do something different. And I just think that's cool that he was such an established figure, and yet he still wanted to keep pushing and still wanted to keep doing things. And then I also think this is a very interesting way to end the film. So people are lauding him with praise. And at the end of the film, he's like, I told my wife that I was going to leave film in 1970. And then I didn't. And then in 1980, I was like, I'm going to leave film. And then in 1990 and 2000, and like so on and so forth. And he's like, I don't say anything now. And it was like, it's interesting that he planned to get away from film, even though he clearly loved doing it, but yet he kept getting drawn back in because of the challenges, or because, he was drawn to work with this filmmaker or work on this project. And that was also another one thing that I thought was so fascinating. One of my favorite parts of the documentary is he talked about his biggest regret was not doing the score for A Clockwork Orange, because Stanley Kubrick wanted him to do the score because he'd heard another score that he did for something else and wanted to hire him. And Sergio Leone did something very shady where he calls him up and he's like, no, Kubrick, he can't work for you because he's already doing a film score for me. So he can't work for you. And Morricone's like, that actually wasn't true. He's like, I was done with that composition. I was just doing the sound mixing. I 100% could have worked on it. And he's like, but I didn't. And he's like, and now that's the biggest regret of my career. So I'm like, yikes.
That's rough.
Yeah. So there are a lot of interesting tidbits. There's a lot of fascinating things. I really enjoyed this. Like I said, I don't know. It's very long. It's very dense. I don't know if it needed to be 2.5 hours, but at the same time, it gets so into the minutia of the composition and the inspiration that it probably could have actually been longer. So I feel kind of two ways about it. But overall, I found it really fascinating and intriguing. Yeah. So I appreciated watching it and learning a lot.
Nice. Well, it definitely sounds interesting.
Yes.
I mean, I love his work. The scores that he's done are incredible.
They really are.
It's interesting to hear you talk about how he felt like an outsider, because I always got that sense about him.
Oh,
like,
interesting.
Feeling like he did such incredible work, but he was still kind of like off of the mainstream.
Yeah.
Like, he was working and toiling and he never stopped working. He worked on like, tons and tons and tons of stuff, but he wasn't getting the recognition of people like John Williams and Hans Zimmer and other people of his ilk.
And they both are
So,
in the documentary. They're both talking heads, and they're both like waxing poetic about him, about what a genius he was, what a master he was. And
mhm,
so it's interesting that they got all the accolades, but they were probably very inspired by him, or certainly thought, that what he was doing was so incredible.
mhm,
So yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, especially his background was his background as a musician was such conventional in its structure, that like it was very much focusing on melodies, very much focusing on classical music. And so it kind of reminds me of, like, when painters learn, I guess any artist, when you learn the basics and then you learn how to break
mhm,
the rules, and then you go off on your own and do your own thing. And that sounds very much like what he
mhm. Yeah. And boy, did he break some rules and make some awesome scores for
did.
film.
Indeed,
Yeah.
indeed. Very memorable.
Anything else you wanted to add about this documentary?
No, I don't think so. I think that was everything.
Oh, cool. So then let's move on to Femme. Okay. So Femme is written and directed by a team, Sam H. Freeman and you pronounce his name Ing Chun Ping. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
I believe so, but I'm not 100% sure.
Uh so yeah, it's written and directed by these two folks, and it stars Nathan Stewart Jarrett and George McKay. And the plot is, this is the IMDb summary, follows Jules, who is targeted by a horrific homophobic attack, destroying his life and career. Sometime after that event, he encounters Preston, one of his attackers, in a gay sauna. He wants revenge. It's not a well written summary, but
No.
kind of gets the job done. So Jules is a drag performer. He he gives like a epic performance, or yeah, he has like a really epic performance, and then he's like out kind of like smoking a cigarette. He sees this guy out there who kind of like gives him a look and then kind of like shuffles away, and he's out getting more cigarettes, and that guy and his friends make gross comments about his appearance, make homophobic comments. He makes a wisecrack back, and then they assault him outside the store. And it's several months later, he's still reeling from the trauma of the attack, and trying to kind of put things back together and regain his confidence. And then he's goes to like a bathhouse and sees Preston there, the guy who attacked him, and he follows him, and they have sex and start to develop like a relationship. He finds out that Preston is heavily closeted and lives with a bunch of like broy, assholey guys. But he starts to see like, more dimension to Preston, while also like plotting revenge against him, wanting to get back at him for this horrible thing that he did to him. So he's planning to film them having sex and then release the sex tape on like a revenge porn website, to out him. And it's about him like both plotting but also like getting to know Preston and starting to have a lot more complicated feelings about everything that's going on, and about whether he even wants to carry out with his plan at the end. Um they get deeper and deeper into their relationship, and then Preston meets Jules's roommates. They invite him to the big drag show, his like comeback show that Jules is going to do for his birthday. And then, at the show, Preston has showed up with a gift for Jules, and then he sees Jules on stage, and Jules is like, "Yeah, I'm back on stage after this gay basher came after me, but like I got him. I I seduced him, and like, he like basically reveals what he's been doing, and the look on Preston's face is priceless. So it ends up that Preston follows him backstage later. They get into a fight, and Preston assaults him again. But then Jules ends up kind of like ends up on top in the fight and ends up leaving. And then he comes home and finds the gift from Preston, which I guess I should have mentioned earlier. When he goes to see Preston for the first time and he's in his apartment, he puts on this hoodie as he's leaving. Like he needs to disguise himself to look more, masculine around Preston's roommate. So he keeps the hoodie, which was you find out was like a knockoff hoodie. And so Preston had got him like the actual real version of that hoodie. So it's just kind of he's sitting there like in his bed, like battered, bruised, bloodied, kind of looking at this hoodie and this note. And that's kind of I think that's the very end of the movie, right? That's kind of
Yeah.
where we leave things.
Yep.
Yeah. So did I miss anything else important over the course of the plot summary?
I mean, for the most part, no, you hit all the main beats. The only things I would add are that, yeah, Preston is very obsessed with keeping up this persona of masculinity, so much so that he's
Mm-hmm.
very controlling to Jules at first, and
Mm-hmm.
is like they text a lot, like for hookups at first, and
Yeah.
then it's like later for dates. But he's like, don't look, and he uses the F word, and like,
Mm-hmm.
basically don't look effeminate, don't look overtly gay, or queer, or whatever
Mm-hmm.
overtly would be. And in his mind, obviously not stereotypically masculine. So I would say that's a component. And then the only other
Yes.
thing is that, oh, and yeah, and like Preston's friends like really like Jules and like invite him out. And,
Yeah.
much to Preston's, chagrin and, concern. And then the only other thing I would say is that when Preston meets Jules' roommates, his the guy roommate, because he has a guy roommate and a woman roommate, and the guy
Mm-hmm.
roommate clearly has the hots for him, because one time at a bar drunk he tries to kiss Jules, and Jules is like, what are you doing, no, no, no. And
Mm-hmm.
he's clearly very like salty about this, because he's while he's nice to Preston, he's clearly doing some shady things by inviting Preston to the drag show. It's like kind of an
Mm-hmm.
underhanded thing. He's doing it
Yes.
on the down low, and yeah, so I think there's that. But other than that, no, you hit all the
Hmm.
major beats.
Thank you. And you were
Of course.
actually reminding me. So there is that dynamic where Preston is the dominant one in the relationship. He's telling Jules what to do. He's, going to a restaurant and ordering for the both of them
Mm-hmm.
and like, you know, saying things like, "Oh, you're gonna do what I tell you to do," and then partway through the film, Jules upends that dynamic and
Mm-hmm.
and seizes control, and he's like, "No, I'm gonna be the dominant one, and you're gonna do what I tell you," and that's how he ends up actually filming them having sex. Is he's like, "Nope, you're gonna do what I tell you," and so yeah, that dynamic gets a little twisty.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, there's that, but yeah, it's also interesting. I was gonna say it's also interesting because yeah, Preston is very much wants to top and make sure,
Hmm.
because I think he wants to top because that's seen as the masculine quote unquote thing to
Right.
do.
Hmm.
But then when Jules does kind of do that upending of the power dynamics and then becomes the top, then it's that like allows Preston to be emotionally vulnerable, and they have this
Hmm.
like really intimate moment. So yeah.
Yeah. I think we finally covered all the points. So what did you think?
I was gonna say maybe you want to start, because I'm gonna say I have very conflicting feelings about this
Mm,
film.
okay.
Yeah, I think it's an excellently made film in certain respects, but yeah, conflicted feelings. So I want to hear what you have to say first.
Well, I think when I was reading about this and like when we were talking about covering it, I thought it sounded really like intriguing
Yeah.
and also like complex, like morally complex and thorny.
Yes.
And I think I initially thought it was going to be more intense in terms of like graphic, both in the attack in the beginning and the the like sex parts of the movie based on like what I was reading about the movie, and I was actually kind of surprised that like I think it handled those aspects in a way that wasn't over the top. Like it I don't know, something about the stuff I'd read about the movie made it seem like it was like at an 11, it was more like at an 8 or a 7. Um but I thought this was good. I mean, I was, hooked by it. I was intrigued to see where it was going to go. I like a noir kind of movie, and this movie is very much so, although very neon at the same
Yes.
time. Lots of like blues and pinks and nightclubs and places, dark spots, abandoned buildings, parks where these hookups happen. And I really was intrigued to see Jules kind of grappling with all these different complex emotions and, being very gung ho about taking revenge and then kind of like softening on that. But then it ends up, all the secrets come out anyway. And I was I don't know, I was captivated by this. I found it intriguing both morally, in terms of, like, the overall, like, arc of the plot, but then I thought, like, the story was told very effectively. It felt very, like, gritty and intense emotionally and complicated and, like, very thorny, I think is a word I keep coming back to. It feels
It's a
very
good word.
thorny.
It really encapsulates what's
Um,
going on.
yeah, and I don't know, I don't know, I liked seeing how Preston's friends end up liking Jules, and it's like he is putting on more of, like, a masculine air than he does, but he's also being himself, which is funny, like, playing Street Fighter. He's really into Street
Mhm.
Fighter, and then, he ends up beating all of the roommates, but he plays as Chun-Li and just wipes the floor with them, and there's just something so amazing about the fact that you have all these macho guys who are playing like, Guile and and Bison and all these people, and then it's like Chun-Li is wiping the floor with them.
Listen, everybody knows or should know Chun-Li's the best.
Yeah.
I feel like
So
I don't wanna be like any true gamer because don't wanna gatekeep, but I feel like, come on.
right.
Stop being broy dudes. Chun-Li's the best.
So I liked that. I liked seeing that there was more dimension to Preston, that he's just a shitty, macho guy who's putting on airs. You do see moments where he like when he takes them out to dinner that first time they go out, and you do see moments of where he's like letting his guard down a little bit and being more tender. Um, later on when he meets the roommates and he's talking about his dream of opening up, a clothing business, like he's
Mhm.
got a street stall, but he's trying to work his way up. I like that his character has more dimension. He's not just the shitty guy that Jules is trying to get revenge on and just the horrible guy that attacked him. There's more to him than that. Which I think often there are people in life that I feel like, okay, they're just we talked about we need to talk about Kevin. Kevin was just a shithead. Like I don't think there was I didn't see any redeeming qualities to Kevin. But I feel like
No.
generally people in life are more complex than that. They're
Yes.
shades of terrible, but also they can be good in other ways. So I felt like that was realistic. I feel like I'm starting to ramble now, so maybe
I don't
let's
think you are,
talk
but
about
I understand.
some of your feelings about the movie, because I'd like to know kind of what's making you feel like really complicated about the movie.
Yeah, so yeah, I know. I feel very complicated
Yeah.
because this is a riveting movie. I do think this is a
Mhm.
well-made film. I think it's really a key or a testament to the excellent, excellent performances by Nathan Stewart Jarrett and George McKay. I think they're both astounding. I think they're
Yes.
so, so good. They both
Mhm.
are imbuing their characters with such complexity. George McKay is even though he's a very aggressive and violent and abusive character, he's also got this very tender core to him,
Mhm.
and he's very subtle in ways. And Nathan Stewart Jarrett imbues his character with so much depth, and you see his pain, and you see the PTSD that he's dealing with from the homophobic and racist attack, and how that has
Mhm.
completely traumatized him, and just
Yes.
he is just stymied completely. Like, he won't leave the house, he won't do drag anymore, he won't go out and see friends. He's just sitting around and playing video games. Not that there's anything wrong with playing video games, but whenever his roommates are like, "Come on, let's go out," and he's like, "No, I'm not doing it. Not
Mhm.
doing it." And it's so it's so sad, to see that pain that he's walking around with. Um, but yeah, as riveting as I found this film, I found it also really repellent, because it's interesting, and I know what you're saying, because there's a lot of discourse around this film already, even though it's not even in wide release yet. And there are a lot of reviews on it. And I actually think the violence in the film is at an 11. I found it really disgusting and to the point of being exploitative, and it really made me uncomfortable. And I mean, of course, the point is to make you uncomfortable. I don't want to be like it's
Mhm.
not, because that is the point. But yeah, so I felt repelled by it, but also I'm fascinated by power dynamics, and the power dynamics in this film are really compelling,
Yes.
really intriguing.
Mhm.
And I think that's where the film really shines, is on both of the two lead performances and the power
Yes.
dynamics, and how
Mhm.
entrenched the two of them are in toxicity, like each of them individually and as a unit, as a couple. And like, it's just, there's such violence between them, like in the beginning and the end, and it's disturbing, but it's fascinating. I will say, as much as I do like that they made Preston really complex, but at the same time, there's a part of me that hates that they made me sympathize with an abuser, because I mean, our
Mhm.
introduction to Preston is he's a racist, homophobic, violent abuser. And of
Right.
course, there's more to him, like just as there is to everybody. But there's something bothersome to me about that. And the fact that when at the end of the film, or at the climax of the film, when he's there and he's so hopeful, and Preston's standing there with his present that he wants to give to Jude, and Jude is on stage in drag, and you never see Jude's face. You only see Preston's face. You only see how the revenge porn scheme is affecting him. And it's an interesting choice, because I'm like, why aren't we seeing Jude too? Like, why aren't we seeing his reaction? Like, it's very intentional. And there's something about that choice that kind of bothered me. And it also bothered me that the film completely seems to forget the fact that Jude is a black man, and everybody else in the film is white or is not black. And, there is this intersection of racism and homophobia that he experiences in this assault and throughout the film.
Mhm.
And he doesn't have any black friends. Nobody he interacts with in the film is black. And that's a strange, strange thing. And that's something that was pointed out by Angelica Jade Bastian, who called this one of the most stunningly anti-black films she'd seen in a long time. And it's a perspective I hadn't thought of until, like, after I read that. I was like, oh yeah, he doesn't have any black friends. That's weird. Like, it's just strange. And it's strange that the film doesn't focus on that. And maybe it's because the filmmakers are not black. One of them is, I believe, a white man, and the other is, I believe, an East Asian man. And so maybe that's why. I don't know. But I feel like, and not necessarily that just having a black filmmaker would necessarily change the scope or the lens of the film, but it does add a different layer of perspective by having personal experience that I think might be missing here. Our friend of the podcast, Monica Castillo, in her review, also pointed out that the film was lacking queer joy, which is something that also really bothered me. That there are not moments of real joy and, like, amidst a queer community, that I feel like we get it at the very beginning, and then we don't get it again. And it just, I don't know, there's something, the dourness of the film kind of bothered me. But like I said, at the same time, this is such a riveting film. It's so fascinating. It's
Mhm.
so compelling. It's so perceptive in certain ways that it's like I said this about I think I said this about We Need to Talk About Kevin. I feel like it's like a car crash. Like it's like a car crash that like I can't look away from,
Right.
in that it's awful but also fascinating. And so I have these like conflicting things where I did enjoy a lot of the movie, but then I feel kind of like a bad person for enjoying it, because I'm like, but wait a minute, what about these other things that I felt really disturbed and bothered by? So yeah, for me, it was a really complicated experience and a complicated film. And like the whole thing was complicated, which is not a bad thing, but also
No.
it's like, there's things I wish it had done differently, or things I wish it had focused on. I wish sometimes it didn't focus so much on Preston, although it is good that they made him complex.
Yeah.
And he broke my heart. And I hate that he broke my heart.
Yeah. Well, I think in the club scene, it was particularly effective to just it ratcheted up the tension so much to see someone like Preston, who is normally feels so in control and so powerful
Yes.
and so macho, just feel
Yes.
so have the rug just pulled out completely from underneath him and feel
Mm-hmm.
so powerless and so worried and so scared. And I just felt like my heart was like beating through my chest during that
Yeah.
scene for him because yeah, he's powerless. Like he's
Mm-hmm.
vulnerable. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, Jules could release that video. He doesn't, but he could, and it could be every bit as scary and terrible for him as he thinks that it would be. And he let his guard down and he trusted him. And like I could almost feel in my own like a pit of my own stomach, like how he
Mm-hmm.
must have been feeling in that moment because yikes.
Yep. Yep. No, absolutely. Like, yeah, it's all awful.
But I agree with you about the lead performances being just really, really compelling. And
So good.
Nathan Stewart Jarrett in particular, I felt like did such an amazing job of
Mm-hmm.
conveying the trauma throughout the film that, you know, his character was grappling with, especially in the beginning. Like, you know, when he's sitting there playing video games, there's just so many subtle things that he's doing with his face to convey, like, how he's feeling and how unsteady and uncertain and how scared he is.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when he actually goes to meet up with Preston and in his apartment, you see so much fear and just kind of uneasiness and like he's fighting through it because he's like he's got like this morbid curiosity of like I need to see where this goes and I need to like
Yeah.
stay with it, but you see him fighting through that and I was just also I found that really compelling.
No, it absolutely is. Part of me, not to rewrite a movie, but part of me wishes I could have seen the two of them in like a totally different genre.
Yeah.
Oh, I wonder if their romance would have flourished if one wasn't, incredibly, internalized their homophobia and violent, and the other wasn't seeking revenge porn.
Right.
Would
Yeah.
these two crazy kids have had a chance in another world?
Right. Yeah, we could have seen the Queer Joy, but I don't think this
Yeah.
was that kind of movie to I mean, I know
It's
it's
not.
frustrating. It's not
Yeah.
it's frustrating to see so few movies that feature Queer Joy, but this is not that movie. I mean, this is a dark, gritty neo-noir thriller and like I was reading through the press notes and the
Mhm.
directors are like, I wanted to make something that was dark, gritty about queer characters going through morally, ethically challenging, gross stuff. Like I wanted to get into it. And I feel like they
Yeah,
did with this movie. They really throw you into it.
they did. I will say though, considering this is coming on the heels of another gritty neon neo-noir queer movie with queer leads that does revel in its romance and queer joy, we have Love Lies Bleeding. And
Mm,
that also is extremely violent and extremely dark and goes into some really gnarly places emotionally and physically. And yet there is still queer joy. And it also deals with homophobia and biphobia and misogyny. And so it's like, it can be done. And they made choices that didn't do that. Absolutely. But I'm just having seen Love Lies Bleeding, which is so good in so many ways and also has issues, but is also so good. It's like, I don't know. And I don't know. I mean, I guess it's also maybe I'm greedy because there's not enough movies that feature, black queer characters and characters who are queer who are having moments of joy or have communities of, that are supportive and nurturing. So I don't
Mhm.
know. I think it's also the fact that that friend, that roommate is so shady. Like
Oh,
maybe if the
yeah.
roommate hadn't been so shady, maybe I'd feel, a little bit different. I don't know. That roommate was a jerk.
Yep.
But yeah, but no, I mean, I've been wrestling with this movie for a bit. Um, yeah, because I saw it several days ago, which is not a very long time, but I've been
Mhm.
really wrestling with it because I was like, this was a fascinating watch. Like this like flew by. It was riveting. It's compelling. The performances are so good. The look of it, the visual aesthetics,
Mhm.
fantastic. And yet I feel kind of sick to my stomach. Like, and who knows? Yeah, maybe that is the point, getting into all these, as you said, thorny, which is such a perfect word for this. Getting into those thorny issues, maybe it is to make you feel sick,
I got that sense reading the
Yeah.
press notes, like, the writer-directors really wanted to throw people into this gross, gritty movie where
Yeah.
it seemed like I'm not quoting anything, I'm just trying to interpret what I read that, like, "See, gay people are terrible too."
Yeah. Yeah. But no, but it's funny that you say that because that kind of echoes to me the press junkets that I've seen for Love Lies Bleeding. Like you see
Mhm.
queer people are messy too. Queer people are fucked up too. Queer people do, terrible shit too. So I get
Mhm.
it. I get that impulse. I don't know. There's certain things that didn't quite land for me, but other things it did. Other things
Yeah.
that I think it does exceptionally well.
Well, it's a movie that we're enjoying talking about despite having gone through it in some ways.
Yeah, yeah, and I will say I keep thinking about Jude and Preston. I keep thinking about both of them. So, when a movie is haunting you and characters when they keep circulating in your mind, that tells you something.
Yep. It's a mark of a good movie, I think. Even if you got complicated feelings.
Totally, totally.
Okay.
Yeah, were there any other parts that you really loved?
No, I think we've talked about most of it. Like,
Oh,
just
I
going through
I
them.
have something.
Oh,
Sorry, I
cool.
just remembered something that I liked. One of the things I really liked was when Preston is when they're having I think it's when they're having breakfast, but maybe it's lunch. Doesn't really matter. When he's meeting with Jude and Jude's roommates and it's the scene where he's talking about his clothing line that he wants to start and he's like,
Mhm.
"Jude has really great style." And it's interesting because the kind of jerk guy roommate is like, "Oh, you don't say," because it's not really what Jude typically wears as a general rule. But I like that Preston is trying to compliment Jude, and even though he's talking about himself, he's being very inclusive by complimenting Jude. And there's something very loving about that. And I think it, it's there's something really sticky about being loving and violent and that kind of entanglement between the two. And I think that's such a why it's such a tragedy that the end of the film happens the way it does is
Mhm.
because it's not to excuse his disgusting homophobic attack, but it would be different if he was violent towards people he didn't know, but then once he got to know, you know, then when he got to know Jude and have this relationship and he's opened up, it would have been nice to see him change, but it's like no, he's still like attacking and
Yeah.
I don't know, it
He's
just reifies the tragedy that's going on, the tragic
yeah.
undercurrent in this film.
I think it's gonna take more than one good relationship to, fix Preston's issues. One of his I mean,
Yes.
his roommate, his buddy describes him as a pit bull that's been dropped on his head too many times, so, I mean, that's
Yeah.
fairly descriptive of his toxicity and his temper and his willingness to just completely throw all reason out the window when he's angry, as he mentions,
Yeah.
throughout the film. I'm a private person. I don't like
Yep.
when people get in my business, and that's you need some therapy and some
Severe
work before
therapy.
you're
Yeah.
gonna.
Yeah, I will say though that is an interesting comparison to make to a pit bull. I get the comparison. I get why people do it, but pit bulls are the sweetest. They're so
Yeah, they are.
lovely. They're
Mm-hmm.
so lovely. They get such a bad rap.
They do.
Sweetest
No,
dogs. So
probably
lovely.
could have just left it on Preston. Preston's a messed up guy.
Yeah, I know. And and I hate that I feel bad for him because part of me does, because it's like he clearly has this bro mentality, in part because it's a form of protection, and he thinks that's what he needs to do, and he clearly that internalized homophobia. He hates himself in part. There's some self-loathing going on,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't want to like him. I don't
Yep.
want to feel bad for him.
No, I didn't either, and that's I think the movie did a good job of showing dimension.
Yeah, and good performances.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and I
Yeah.
love the score too. I thought the score was really good. It had like this intense, like
Yes.
thumping club, like just made me so uneasy all the time.
That is not what I thought you were gonna say. I don't know. I thought you were gonna say it pumped me up, and then you're like, oh, it made me
No, it made me uneasy. It was like I shouldn't feel like I'm in the club all the time. There's a
was gonna
time
say,
and a place for the club.
do you feel uneasy at the club? I miss going to the club in a weird way.
Mm,
There's a sense of freedom there. Anyway.
yeah.
But that score, you do not feel free. That is correct.
No, it's very tense.
It is. It is. It's ratcheting things up.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, anything else?
Nope. I think that's it for me.
All right. Okay, so let's do a quick recap. So, Ennio, that's is that going to be playing in theaters?
Yes.
Okay,
And it's coming to VOD later.
cool. All right, so Ennio will be in theaters. Sounds like you would recommend it.
I would. Yeah, I'm sorry. I just saw that it is in theaters and it's coming to VOD April 9th. Yeah, I would. It is long, so you might want to break it up into parts.
Mm-hmm.
Um and again, I am no musician, so who knows? Maybe you'd like it more if you are a musician, maybe you'd like it less. I don't know. But yes, I enjoyed it. I think it was worth watching to see a genius at work.
Nice. Do you feel like it's a better at-home watch since it's longer, or do you feel like people would really get a benefit from seeing it in the theater?
That's a great question. Because there's pros and cons to both, because in the theater you're getting a more than likely a better sound system, so you really
Mm-hmm.
get to absorb the music, because so much of the film is his music. But at home you get to break it up, so I feel like yourself. If you can sit through a 2.5 hour documentary, and this is an interesting documentary, this does not feel like it's like sluggish, or I didn't feel tortured by like the runtime by any means. But if you really want the full scope and experience, and it's playing near you, yeah, I would say go see it. But if you're not somebody who can sit still for long, if you're fidgety, maybe wait till it comes home and break it up into parts.
Fair enough.
No shame to watch it at home or in the theater.
Cool. All right, and then Femme is going to be in theaters in LA, New York, and then opening nationwide on April 5th. What do you think? See it? Don't see it?
I think your mileage is going to vary. I think it depends. I think it's a great film in many ways. Like I said, I think excellent performances. I think it's well made. I think it might be triggering for some people though. So
Yes.
I think you have to
Mm-hmm.
know yourself and, go in forewarned, because it might be too intense for you. Or, like in your case, Evan, you were like, oh, I thought it was going to be way worse, so,
Yeah.
I think it just depends. We all have different triggers. We all have different things that upset us. So,
Right.
be prepared to, going into that. But it's hard for me to say like, yeah, go see it. But at the same time, it's a very complicated film, which I think is great and the performances are excellent and it's well made. So yeah. So for me, I'd say your mileage may vary. It depends.
Mm-hmm. I would say see it, but I'm going to give the qualification that you did around the content and kind of knowing that it's a difficult content. It may be tough for some people. So just kind of go in with that in mind if you're going to watch it. But
yes,
I found it compelling for all the reasons we've mentioned.
It is compelling. It is a riveting watch. You are right.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that wraps up another episode of Spoiler Piece Theater. We want to say a huge thank you to our editor, Otto Clammer. Otto, thank you for making it sound great week after week.
Thanks, Otto.
Also want to give a shout out to our sponsor piece patron, Heather Sachs. Heather, thank you for your support.
Thanks so much, Heather.
You can find the show anywhere you get podcasts. You can also go to our website, spoilerpiece.com. You can find a link to our merch there. We have a TeePublic store with all kinds of great Spoiler Piece stuff.
Yeah.
T-shirts, notebooks, pillows, all kinds of good stuff. Mugs. You can support the show that way. You can connect with us on social media. We're Spoiler Piece Theater on Facebook. We're at Spoiler Piece on Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, and wherever else. wherever other social medias we may reside.
Facebook threads.
Yeah. You can also get in touch with us some old-fashioned ways. You can send us an email, spoilerpiece@gmail.com, or you can give us a call.
At 862-21-PEACE.
Leave us a message. Talk to us about either of these movies or neither of these movies. Message us about other movies that we have or have not talked about. We're really ready to talk about just about anything. Ask us your food opinions. We do have strong food opinions sometimes.
We do. We have strong opinions about everything, but especially food. Yeah.
We'll trade recipes. We're not picky. We liked hearing from you. So so reach out in one way or another. And if you like the show, please consider rating and reviewing us. You can go to ratethispodcast.com/spoilerpiece, and that will take you to your platform of choice. And if you really, really like the show, please consider joining our Patreon. For $5 a month, you get access to exclusive bonus episodes every week. And as I mentioned at the top of this show, we talked about the 2011 film We Need to Talk About Kevin, which was the winner of our poll, our March poll on women directors, which is another thing you get access to when you're a $5 patron.
Yeah.
You can vote in polls. We have polls every month. You can vote on what we're going to watch. So that's another fun thing. You can do that over at patreon.com/spoilerpiece. And I think I've covered everything. So my name is Evan Crean. I am co-chair of the Boston Online Film Critics Association, co-author of Your 80s Movie Guide to Better Living, and co-host of It's the Pictures podcast, which is available wherever you get podcasts. And you can follow me on social media as Real Recon, and that's real as in film reel, on all the friggin' platforms.
I love that you're like, I'm too tired to run them down.
Yeah.
You know where to go, people.
Yep, just search. That's a unique enough handle. I don't think anyone has taken it other places.
And I'm Megan Kearns. I write for Edge Media Network. I'm a co-host of the Slashers podcast. I too am a member of the Boston Online Film Critics Association, and I'm a member of Gallica. You can follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Opinion S World, or on Instagram and Letterboxd at The Opinion S.
We'll see you next week.
Bye.